Oh, now being recorded. Okay, I better be careful. I'm not going to do my joke today. I have a private department here, and I did a joke the other day. And I'm going, oh no. But look, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me here today, and it is a great pleasure. And you know that sincerely. I do love to come along to the Powerful Women events and have an opportunity to meet everybody, because I really do care passionately that what we need to be doing is really supporting women in the energy field. Now, also, I'm going to apologise to my department over there as well. They always do me a brilliant speech, and thank you, it's a brilliant speech, but I am going to ignore it completely. And only because I think there's some important things that do need to be said. I will sort of go down a little bit, all right, but yeah. So I think there's a few things that I just want to say. And I think the first is to acknowledge the great work that Powerful Women do. I can see Georgina at the back. Thank you so much for inviting me here. And this was started, I don't know whether anybody's aware, but it was started by almost like two Sandys, wasn't it? It was Sandy Verma, who I don't think you managed to get hold of for today, but is a fantastic advocate for making sure that we do get women in the right place, but also from Laura Sanders as well, who again really wants to make sure that we get women into these key roles. But the reason why I'm not going to look at my speech so much is because when I look, it's given me facts and figures. And what I really want to talk about today is the reality of where we find ourselves. And I know you've got results that are going to be published, results that are indicating that clearly we're going in the right direction. But I think my challenge is are we going far enough? And how do we get to where we should be? And I think it's very good to be able to say we should be doing this. And I know we've had many conversations about this. The question is that we need to act. I think, how do we act to make sure that we're doing lots of getting more women and making sure that it's possible for women to get to these positions? And I was thinking why, as I was on my way here today, and I've been on the road since 8 o'clock, got very, very soaked to my first meeting at 8 o'clock this morning. And I was thinking, what is it that, how I find myself here today? And I find myself here today very late in life. So I'll be 63 in 2 weeks' time. I didn't get doing the job I really wanted to do until really I was 53. I had it on my to-do list for a long time. Become an MP was something I really wanted to do. But I didn't have the confidence to do it. And I think that is a message I'd like to say, is that we need to really be instilling confidence in people. But then I got to thinking, but why do I eventually find myself here? And I just wanted to, I often talk about my granddaughter, who is the little love of my life. She's 4.5, and I hope will be able to feel as though she can go on and do anything that she wants to do, whatever that will be. But I was also thinking of a most amazing, inspirational person who was my nan. And my nan was 97 when she died, and she was just an absolute character. In fact, both my nans were characters. But I think what she did, and this is a really important message that I wanted to say today, what she did is she gave me a fantastic role model to look up to. And so she wanted to be a ballet dancer, actually. And one day she was doing some ballet dancing and she hit the side of the stage and could never walk again properly because she crushed her ankle. And going back to, it would have been, 1909 or something like that. The medicine wasn't the same as it was. And so she could never walk properly again. But she had a great passion for life. She loved to go on holidays, but also she worked all the way through her life. And I think that's quite amazing, actually, when you look back. And I think of my mum, who was a lab technician, but then stopped when she had the family. My nan wasn't like that. She worked. And the reason she worked was because she wanted to. She actually really felt stimulated. She was she learned shorthand, Pitman's shorthand, if anybody's ever done shorthand, and she loved her job, working for the chief exec or the principal of the local college. And she really got great reward from that. And I think as a family, that therefore has indicated to us that you can do things. She gave us opportunity and gave us hope and inspiration. And so my message, I think, to everybody here today is not just to think about yourself, but you really do need to be that inspiration for the next lot of people who are coming forward. Because today, when we look at the figures, they're okay. Certainly we've seen an increase in certain aspects, but they're not as good as they should be. Just being absolutely honest with you, I know you're going to have a panel discussion, and that grieves me. And if we don't do something here today, and I think I said this last year actually, we're just going to be no further on. then that's where my challenge is. We've got to do something now, not talk about it now. I'm sorry, I'm on my, you shouldn't have invited me because I'm on my high horse now, but not just talk about it, but we absolutely have to do something. I have 2 daughters, both have chosen their careers. I've got my granddaughter, and what I want her to do is believe that she can do something, coming back to why I left it so late in life. So I think that's the most important message is today for all of you here, that I could stand here and say, pat you on the back and say it's great. And by the way, you are all amazing. And anybody who's listening, you are amazing as well. But let's hold the hands of all of those people just to make sure they come on that journey with us, and then we can take them forward and have lots more women where they should be. That's not to say, because there's a few men here. I think it's about equal balance. I don't think we should even look at gender. I just think we should the best person for the job. Now then, I've got some notes here that I'm not quite sure whether I've covered or not, and I'm sure Nick could probably tell me from the back. There are figures that I could talk about, and I'm just having a cursory look down here. 16% of executive directors are women, same as in 2023. Not good enough, I suggest. Just 29% of all board members are women, same as 2023. Not good enough. Let's not be complacent about this. How do we attract top talent? And I think that is one of the questions that we're here to think about. You attract top talent by believing in people. I say you're holding people's hands, getting them into this amazing, amazing field. And just really one of the things I love to do is tell stories, as you know. That's one of the things we can do is really embrace people as well. So really important that we attract top talent. Question I had here as well is, what can government do? I'm standing here as a government minister saying to you, we want to do more. If you have any ideas whatsoever, let me know. Georgina, I don't know where Georgina's gone. You and I, we have lots of conversations about this, but we've also had lots of roundtables. But let's say government is prepared to do something. So do let me know. Final note, I think I've actually covered all my notes here, but in a very different way to how you say. It says helping women reach their full potential. It genuinely is about belief in yourself. It's about mentoring. It's about showing people that they can do something. But it's also, I think one of the big things is, it's okay not to do something. And one of the hardest things that I found in my life, another reason why it took me so long, is I just didn't want to fail. And sometimes in life, you have to put yourself forward. You have to take a risk. You have to put yourself forward to fail. And I think that's really difficult when you're standing alone. And that's why, again, I say to everybody, help each other. Because if somebody's going to take a risk, hold their hand while they're taking that risk. And I think that's just a really important message to do. So I just want to say thank you. Thank you to all of you here today. I've got an exciting day ahead of me. I had orals yesterday. I've got a select committee today. So I've got to zoom back to the house really, really quickly. But thank you sincerely, all of you, for coming here today. Thank you for inviting me to talk about a subject I desperately care about, a subject I feel so passionately about, a subject that's important for my daughters, for my granddaughter, and for future generations as well. And if there's anything that I can do, just as always, just let me know. All right, thank you so much. Thank you very much.
So thank you so much, Amanda. I know you had to Zoom.
Sorry.
She's always a really difficult act to follow because she gives such a kind of genuine and heartfelt insight into why this is important. There we go. Minister plus entourage. So, sadly, I think I don't have the liberty of ditching my speech and not doing statistics because my main role is to unveil the statistics. So let me start clicking and see if it works. You should be liberated. Or do I point at you? I'll try going the other way. Maybe you're going to have to click for me, Grace. Oh, no. Did someone do that, or was that me?
We're doing it.
You're doing it. Okay, right. I'm now putting this down and stepping away from control. So no, I'm excited to talk about these statistics this year. So this, of course, is our 10th anniversary year, and I think it's a really good opportunity to look at where we've got to. But first, a little bit about powerful women. And I actually love the idea of the two Sandys, although maybe that's not the way that we should describe our founding members. But we are celebrating a decade of championing women in the UK energy sector since Baroness Sandy Verma and Laura Sandys set up Powerful Women. And at that point in 2014, women were largely absent from the boards of UK energy companies. And frankly, 2014 doesn't really sound that long ago. And it's pretty shocking that then, when they started this enterprise, 9% of all board seats were held by women and just 5% of executive director roles. So pretty tiny numbers. And they first started the initiative to gather and report data in 2015. And frankly and fundamentally, Powerful Women was established to change that picture. So what are we working for? Oh, I think we need to go one back. There we are. We're working for the sort of North Star of a gender balanced, diverse and inclusive energy sector in the UK. And 18 months ago, we stepped up our challenge to the sector by setting a new ambitious goal. We want to see at least 40% of women in all leadership and middle management roles in the sector by 2030. And we are really trying to help the sector achieve this by working collaboratively with energy companies, with the government, as we just saw, with the regulators and organisations and individuals who are really passionate about this topic. And we basically, at Powerful Women, do three things. So we support, we challenge, and we connect. We support companies to improve their own diversity and to share examples of good practice and kind of learn from each other. We connect people through our networking events, through our mentoring program, and partnerships with like-minded organisations. And I think, actually, from my perspective, most importantly, we challenge everybody, but particularly organisations, to go faster and to do better. And a lot of that challenge comes from publishing research and reporting publicly on progress, and that's really what today is about. So I really believe, and this is one of the things that first attracted me to Powerful Women, that data matters, and that by tracking how we're doing on gender diversity in our biggest energy employers, every year we can drive greater transparency and also accountability for improvement. And we complement that challenge with also trying to bring some practical suggestions, which is actually one of the questions I think I get asked such a lot. What can we practically do in organisations to make sure that we access the talent that we need to succeed? So on to the next slide, which is why diversity matters, which I think actually everybody in this room probably believes in, and to some extent, and we were talking actually as I came in about the fact that we need more men in this room to also kind of buy into that, because I look out here and I see many familiar faces, and I know you know this, but I do think that diversity, equity and inclusion has never been more important in our rapidly changing sector. So transitioning our energy systems to net zero in a just, orderly and affordable manner is going to need really significant change. And I know that many of us spend a lot of time thinking about that in our day-to-day jobs. And to successfully deliver these goals, we're going to need a broader and more diverse range of people and skill sets. And we're also to rise to that challenge, because I think there's a lot of evidence that diverse teams are fundamentally more innovative and effective. And one of the things I also believe is that we also need to, as a sector, be much more representative of the communities and the customers that we serve. So there's a lot of research that shows that DEI leads to very strong business outcomes and has a positive impact on pretty much everything. So from performance and innovation to talent attraction and retention, and also brand reputation and consumer trust. And I think it's never been more important to keep our industry focused on diversity, because there is, I think, some evidence, as I'm sure you all see and feel, of a bit of a public backlash. And I have to say that from the conversations that I have with energy leaders who work with Powerful Women, I think they all get it. But it is clear that we need to do more to reach and engage with the majority. And it is also clear that the imperative to build a net zero workforce, and I think we need to add an estimated 500,000 people to our industry between now and 2050, and that imperative to build that workforce is as strong as ever, and filling those roles with the best and most diverse talent available is crucial. So now the power of data. Gathering and reporting data on diversity of all kinds helps companies know whether they're meeting their goals or not. And if they're off track, it helps them course correct. And this year, together with Bain and Company, we've gathered statistics on female representation in the top 80 UK energy companies by employee numbers. So together, these companies employ more than 190,000 people in the UK. So it's a pretty representative view of the sector. We get the numbers from either direct engagement with the company or from their published information, and this should all be correct, fingers crossed, as of end of January 2024. It's also just worth saying that the improvement that you see over time is largely driven by company results and increasing representation, but we do change the mix of companies every year to keep it to the top 80, although we only adjust by a maximum of 10% a year. So with that, on to the results. So I think Amanda Solway made the point that the results were kind of okay, but not good enough. And I think I would just emphasize that point when we look at women on boards. So these are the very top leadership teams of our sector, executive and non-executive directors. And I think it is disappointing that, frankly, progress has really stalled this year. So the proportion of women in board seats in energy here is 29%, so unchanged from last year's figure. And that's still 11% off the 40% by 2025 target, which was set by the FTSE Women Leaders Review, and which actually the FTSE 350 met last year. So I think it does show that our sector is actually one of the lagging sectors in the FTSE. Also, and sometimes these kind of digging into this is even more striking. Of these 80 companies that we follow, only 3 have a female chair. And in addition, 20% of those 80 companies have no women on their boards at all, which is a small improvement from 21% last year, but really I think in some ways the most shocking statistic of all. Then moving on to look at female executive directors, which is actually difficult data to get because there are different reporting characteristics between UK and European countries, but it's often CEOs and CFOs, so it's a pretty good proxy for women in crucial decision-making roles. And this has also plateaued. So 16%, which is just over a sixth of executive directors in our sector, are women, and that's also unchanged from last year. And within these figures, again, digging in a little bit, we can see that only 4 companies, which is 5% of our sample, have a female CEO, and that's actually lower than it was this time last year. In addition, 74% of companies have, so about 3/4, have no female executive directors on the board at the moment. So if we move then to women in levels below the board, and this is the second year that we're then looking at women in leadership and middle management, which we very much see as the pipeline to those top decision-making roles on the board. Just as a reminder, leadership is defined here as the executive committee and their direct reports, and that's the same as the way that the FTSE Women Leaders Review look at the data. And then middle management is 2 further levels below that. We don't have great data at the moment, or comprehensive data at the moment. So at the moment, we only have 34 and 31 of the 80 companies providing us with insights into leadership and middle management. But on the flip side, those who do give us that data are by far the largest energy employers. So that actually makes up 80% of the energy workforce. So I think it's still pretty demonstrative. And the results for these levels show a much more positive picture. So women are progressing into wider leadership roles, and you can see that 34% of the leadership roles are currently held by women, and that's up 3% from 31% in 2023. So that's quite a decent move. And comparing energy to other sectors, women make up 35% of leadership roles in the FTSE 100 as a whole, and 34% in the 250. So we're kind of on par with other sectors when it comes to leadership roles. And then moving on to middle management, at that level, women now occupy 32% of the roles. So it's a small positive change of 1% from last year. And I think progress here is really important to make sure that we do have the leadership pipeline. And so at Powerful Women, I think these levels are going to continue to be a focus for us. And it's also important, actually, that more is done by the companies to define and gather this data about their employees and management at all levels. Because while it's clear that women are a growing portion of these levels, it's also important that companies work hard to retain this talent. And we know from our research that mid-career point is the point at which women often find challenges and a lack of progress in their careers. And the sort of the gap in effective policies or supportive workplace culture can halt progress at that point. So I'm looking forward to seeing the numbers here continue to rise towards our 40% target and sort of bring that pipeline up for the top board roles. So now taking a bit of a step back, this is our 10th anniversary year. And it is a good moment to look back at progress since we started measuring the data in 2015. So over the past decade, there has been more than a threefold rise in the number of women on energy company boards. So we've gone from 9% to 29%, and a similar rise in executive directors from 5 to 16. So I think whilst it's tempting to feel despondent about the stalling of progress, there are reasons to celebrate and to be optimistic. And overall, I think it is a positive picture and there are positive results to celebrate. I think maybe sticking to some of those high points, one of the things that we're doing this year is sort of shining a light more on some of the individual company performances. And I'm really pleased to see that some 30% of companies assessed by Powerful Women and Bain have already reached or surpassed the goal of 40% female representation at board level. And that this chart shows the growth over the last 5 years of companies achieving that 40% diversity or women on boards. And that's in the pink. So I think you can see the names of the individual companies there, and a huge congratulations to the 24 companies who've achieved this year. In addition, 17% of companies have now also reached 40% of women in executive director roles. So there's 12 companies that have managed that. So congratulations to those as well. And I think it is important to really highlight these examples because it does show that concerted effort and real kind of leadership commitment does actually lead to progress. So if we look at other companies taking the lead and now look at the leadership and middle management levels, we can again see that there are companies who are really showing that the targets are achievable and showing the way. So 26% of companies, which is up, it's a big increase, up from 12% in 2023, have already met our target of at least 40% of leadership roles held by women by 2030. So they're actually 6 years ahead of our target. And in fact, some companies like BP, Good Energy, National Grid and SGN have even achieved or are just about to achieve gender parity on their leadership teams. For women in middle management, only 13% of the companies that gave us the data have met 40% at this point, but there's promising progress and more than half of the companies show an improvement year on year from 23 to 24. And I think it's also good for me to see that many of the best performers this year are in our Energy Leaders Coalition, which is made up of the heads of some of the UK's largest energy companies. And I think it's also quite illuminating. I would ask you all to have a look in detail at some of the company statistics You can see how your company's doing, but you can also look across the sector and see who are the leaders and the laggards. So, moving on to our ambition. So I think whilst this analysis shows that the sector's progress towards gender balance has slowed and frankly isn't as fast as we'd like, the 40% targets do remain in reach. And I think this is a really good way of looking at what we need to do to actually get there. So in terms of the board level, adding just one more woman per board in the top 80 companies this year would bridge the gap to 40% by 2025 and would pull our sector up to match the rest of the FTSE. Then as we look at the leadership, adding just 5 additional women to each leadership group by 2030. So that's fewer than 1 woman per company per year over the next 6 years would mean that as an industry, we would hit our 40% target in leadership by 2030. Reaching the 40% target in middle management requires a bit more effort because the numbers are bigger. And we've had a look at what the average kind of middle management population looks like. So we think the average middle management team size is around 600 people. And today there's about 200 of those 600 who are female. With a 6-year runway, we really think we could get that population to 40% if companies focus on bringing 50 more women into their leadership group, into their middle management group over that time period, which adds up to 8 women into middle management in each company, in an average company per year. So that kind of quantifies the sort of work that's required to reach our goals. And I think we shouldn't underestimate that that is going to need quite strong, intentional and targeted efforts to change the status quo. But while the 40% in 2030 seems bold, and perhaps you might think too bold given today's statistics, I think the analysis and also looking at the performance of some of the leading companies shows that it really is possible. And I think also it's important that we continue to set a high bar and challenge organisations to actually get to a level that sets them on a path towards gender balance. So I guess one of the questions that we've been asking ourselves, and you may too after hearing this data, is why has there been stagnation after some really quite significant progress over many years? And I think one of the things that we think is perhaps the easy actions, so the kind of low-hanging fruit, have already been taken by companies, and now it's the things that are in the more difficult box that need to be challenged. And when we think about what's in the more difficult box, it's things like the challenge of changing company cultures so that women feel comfortable actually using the policies that are in place and that have been brought in, like flexible working, and also men feel comfortable to use those policies too. And I hope these are some of the topics that our panel is going to pick up on when they reflect on the data, and I'm looking forward to hearing their comments. In this year's report, we've included some recommendations for actions and a blueprint for companies in the spirit of practical advice. And that includes a suggestion that companies form their own bold ambitions, so something with measurable targets and something that's got sustained leadership commitment, that they put in place an actionable strategy and also invest in critical enablers like governance, resourcing, technology and data. And within this blueprint, I think the big takeaway is it's really important just to go further than counting the representation of women, but actually focus on creating an inclusive organisation. And I think Bain's recent research has found that employers who viewed their organisations as not just diverse, but also inclusive, are much more likely to feel comfortable bringing new ideas to the table. And in fact, gains in creative thinking are much higher as we increase inclusion as well as just diversity alone. So we're also trying to share what works and share good practice. And it's great, I think, that in this year's report, we have some good practice case studies that spotlight some of our best performing companies. So Harbour Energy is one of the few that has achieved 40% or more female representation at all levels, so board, executive directors, and they have, of course, one of the few female CEOs in the sector, leadership and middle management. BP, and I see some BP folks here today, have achieved gender parity on its board and for executive directors, and is very close to gender parity at the leadership level. National Grid, where I think Claudia and I are proud to say the leadership level is actually at the level of gender parity, and it's one of the few companies to have that balance at this level. And Shell, which has achieved 40% female representation on its board and reached gender parity for executive directors. So we're going to hear more from Cordy on the panel, and also Fran Woodward from Good Energy, who's going to reflect on how they achieved their excellent results as well. So I'd like to finish with a renewed call to re-accelerate progress towards, I think, the gender-balanced industry that we all want, and one that has the talent that it needs for the energy transition. So I'd like to ask those here representing companies to please go away and look at your data and commit to really moving the needle to our 2030 targets. It's pretty disappointing to see how many women there still are in the very top decision-making roles in our sector, and to actually see progress on women in boards, on boards stalling in the last 12 months. But it's also good to see the rise in the number of women in wider leadership roles, and that the sector seems on track to meet Powerful Women's target of 40% of these roles by 2030. We need to keep up the momentum, and we also need to get much better at gathering data below board level. I really do welcome the engagement and genuine commitment of some of the industry's largest employers. And there's, I think, a lot to learn from those who have already achieved 40% and beyond. But it's also clear that much, much more needs to be done. And companies need to appoint, develop and retain more women across all levels. And as we, Powerful Women, move into our next decade, and also as we get ever closer to 2030, I really hope we can all work together to re-energise our efforts to meet our targets. We're going to continue to challenge the sector, continue to track the data, but we're also going to offer support to help overcome the remaining challenges and get to a gender-balanced industry. So I'm going to leave it there, but thanks once again to Bain and Company for their support in compiling and analysing this year's data. I mean, I really think this is a fantastic, it's comprehensive deep dive into gender representation in our sector in 2024, and I think the recommendations are very thought-provoking as well. I also want to thank the Powerful Women team. They write the speech, and so they often don't get a thanks, but I think they frankly do an amazing amount with relatively little resource, and it's hugely impactful, so well done. And then to everybody joining us, thank you for coming. Do share your own thoughts and feedback on today's statistics online and on the chat function and on social media. Listen to the panel, and then please keep the conversation going afterwards. And I'm very much looking forward now to hearing from our panellists and hearing their response to our statistics and what they think can be done to move the needle. So Olga, I'm going to hand it over to you. This is Olga Muscat, Senior Partner and Head of UK Utilities. Thank you. My pleasure.
Welcome. It's a real pleasure to host you all today and host everybody virtually as well. May I ask our panelists please to step forward? There's place for you. And I think we are going to have Stuart on Zoom as well. Where would you like to go? Before we start, I was reflecting on my very rainy journey coming here today. I'm going to say something different. I'm actually really, really proud to have worked in the UK energy sector for over 20 years. I'm actually Polish, but I have worked in the UK sector. Not only it is an absolute vital resource for our society, energy, but we are at the absolute center of transition to net zero economy. We are the plumbing without which the country will not transition. And there is a lot to be proud of, really. We are absolute leaders in renewable technology. Lots of companies here played huge part in that. We are at the forefront of deploying batteries on the system. We are really putting a lot of effort into checking and testing carbon capture and storage, hydrogen. In my particular sector, we reduced emissions 80% since 1990. 80% reduction in power sector carbon emissions. And today, I think there's news we exceeded the carbon budget by 15%. Well, at the same time, like I'm also fully cognizant, this is just the beginning of the journey. And I think, Katie, you were mentioning that we need to create 500,000 new jobs. Actually, our Bain research says not just do we need to create 500,000 new jobs, but we need to retrain and reskill 4 million people in order to achieve net zero. And energy, pretty much all of that is happening in energy. So if I reflect, like, why am I talking about this? Like, what's the connection? For me, D&I in energy, this is not a target, it's not an ambition, it's an absolute prerequisite to playing the role we need to play going forward. We're not going to achieve energy transition if we don't attract, develop, retain all the talent we have. So with that, a bit longish, but I hope you understand my passion for the topic. Introduction, let us start on the role the companies, the policymakers, and regulators can play in moving the needles. And Katie, you've introduced us very nicely. Thank you. Just so that you can put the name, the face to the name. We have Stuart on the screen here. We have Rachel on the very left, Cordy in the middle, and Fran on my left. Great. So let me just start with the first question. I do have to say that, Katie, your speech was depressing in many, in many aspects. I mean, it is not really great for anybody to hear that they have plateaued. 29% for boards, 16%, only 16% for executive directors. Some increase in leadership, just great to see. So hearing those statistics, what are your reflections on that? What do you think is there to be proud of? What's encouraging? What's disappointing? Do you want to start, Fran?
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody's said it, haven't they? It is disappointing. I would agree or concur with the report that it's probably true that people have done the more straightforward things and now we need to dig a lot deeper. On the plus side, I am an optimist and I take, positively that the action that this group has taken has shown clear results. So it indicates that the focus is on the right things. And I do think, and I know we're going to talk about it, that a real focus on culture now and on inclusion and on what that really means beyond women, and it's not to negate how important gender is in that, is absolutely necessary now. And we've got to lift it up to that level, to your point around what does this incredible industry need to achieve and how will we attract to it fantastic talent from much broader walks of life in order to make progress going forward. So I'm optimistic still, however, feel that there needs to be some practical, challenging things now, that beyond the sort of high level recommendations of the report, that there are some very practical things that I think most firms could be testing themselves against to see whether they're getting under the surface of it and beyond the obvious actions.
Yeah, great points. And maybe to put one positive statement from Katie's speech that I sort of held on to was, we've seen really great progression over 10 years. There's a decade of change, and committing as a sector to change is going to be absolutely critical. The business case for more women at the top is so obvious when you talked about the big challenge for society. and the massive transformation of our energy systems that, ultimately leave a legacy for future generations. We have so much purpose in our sector, and yet we lack attraction. And, I held on to something that the Minister said earlier, that this critical role of senior role models, inspiring others, seeing is believing. So we can all build the pipelines, but we have to make sure that those roles come up and through. And it's a bit of a vicious cycle when they don't. You do need to believe and you do need to see. So we do actually urgently need to address the top of the house, the sector attractiveness and the individual role models that show that anything is possible on this amazing mission to net zero that we're all on. I was really encouraged by the middle management and leadership numbers, actually. It was a great strategy that Katie and the team put forward. Let's start to measure deeper into those layers, and that's where we have seen momentum. So, what gets measured gets done. And I was appealed by the sort of giggle test of, actually, if we hire very deliberately into those layers every year, the trajectory actually does make sense. And so now it's sort of creating the urgency. And one of the ways I really value in sort of creating the urgency is through the collaboration of the big networks, the big business owners coming together. So I really value the Energy Leaders Coalition that I have the privilege to sit on, and I've got great colleagues in the audience who are leading the way, and we're sharing, we're learning from each other. So there's a trajectory there that we absolutely should take urgency from and build from.
Thank you. In terms of good news stories, I'd like to start by congratulating the Powerful Women team and Bain in terms of just such a comprehensive data-led report, which I think you say in terms of, sort of measuring managing that change. In terms of what disappoints me, I'd say as part of my day job, I look after the FTSE Women Leaders and the Parker Review, which look at the FTSE 350 companies. And at a time when we've got, I think it's 96% of the FTSE 100 have managed to get at least one member of an ethnic minority on their boards, that you have 20% of energy companies that don't have one woman, 50% of the population represented on their boards. I find that statistic really took me aback. And so I think that the message from that is that we should not be too distracted by the leaders and be looking back mindfully at what's going on with the laggards and actually thinking about those practical solutions and how do you create change.
Stuart.
Good morning. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, perfect.
Awesome. I'm going to, I'm afraid, be very boring and probably echo lots of the things that have been said before. Oh, can you still hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, okay, my screen's gone blank. I'll carry on talking and not get nervous. I think there's lots to be optimistic about. I think there's lots to be quite despondent about. So I take Katie's point that 80% of the, if you like, workforce was represented, but to have less than half the companies actually fill out the form, I find that quite worrying, and speaks to me in terms of what more do we need to do to get the sponsorship into those areas. There are really positive stories in what we've just heard, not least talking about the fact that if you, Katie, your quote was, you said a threefold increase in achievement in a number of the metrics. We need to tell that story. Number one, that's a really positive story. But secondly, those companies that are hitting the metrics that we've all set, we need to keep telling that story. And as exactly as the one of the panelists has just said, flip the attention to the others who aren't, to be able to say, well, we're no longer saying this is an aspirational target. We're no longer saying this is something to dream of. We're saying this is the table stakes. This is the bare minimum of what you should be doing. And by the way, 12, 14 of your competitors can do it. So what's stopping you? And rather than the conversation being purely about how can we help enable it, it's almost to say, right, and maybe the regulators can help in this, is to say literally, using data, you are a real laggard. What is getting in your way? So how do we help those companies see what are the obstacles that need to be removed? But all of that for me is consistent in really good storytelling. And there's lots in the report to be positive about. And the last thing I'd say is I would totally echo thanks to the Powerful Women team and to Bain the quality of a really robust data-led report makes those conversations much easier and much more straightforward.
Thank you. My second question is a little bit more provocative. Katie, you just talked about we probably picked up the low-hanging fruit. And I will speculate that boards put women from outside the sector on the boards. They put people from non-technical roles like HR and customer service. But probably talking about data, if we were to look at the data more detail, where the challenge is likely, I speculate, to lie is the cooperations actually of our sector. And that's why I will highlight it, Harvard Energy. They are the cooperations. It's very inspirational story. So my edgy question is, do we actually have this whole DEI the absolute wrong way around? Is it about diversity as an input, or is it diversity is an output of creating a culture, as Yvonne mentioned, which is meritocratic, which develops all talent, attracts all talent, rewards all talent, and diversity follows? I will start actually, Stuart. Oh, yes, I put you on the spot. Let's start the other way around now.
Is that okay? So
Yes.
I am. You asked a provocative question. I'll give a provocative answer. I have worked in the space of people development, including diversity and inclusion and talent development for 20 plus years. I am not a fan and have never been a fan of diversity targets. I understand they have a role and I understand they help drive change and conversation, but I don't think they're always the right route. And so I have always been an advocate of starting with inclusion. And what, as a relatively smaller organization, as an employer, what the NSTA has done since we were created in 2015 was talk very openly with our staff about inclusion, not diversity. We see inclusion as being both, if you like, your question was, is it an input and an output? It's an input and an output. We start by saying we want to be a genuinely inclusive working environment that attracts and retains cool people, enables them to do the things that we think makes them cool in the first place, and doesn't squish that out of them, celebrates their difference, allows them to bring their whole self to work. And we believe if we get that right, diversity as a metric will flow. And I sit in an organization that has, by coincidence or by design, a female-dominated board, mathematically, a female-dominated leadership team, executive, mathematically, 51-49 gender split in the organization, and I think 47-48% of our senior kind of leadership, the leadership cadre that we would talk about in Powerful Women, are women. We've never set those as mathematical targets. We've said we want to have a place where you can bring your whole self to work and be valued for it. For me, the big prize in there is there's a risk of an arms race coming. There is a risk where we are going to have gender set against other forms of diversity representation, other forms of metrics. And we end up almost having lobby groups playing one off against the other, which would be mad. I think our job is to create the right culture where people are able to be themselves, be rewarded for being themselves, and contribute to a working culture. And for me, if that's what you believe in, starting with inclusion makes that much easier. But I know that's not going to be to everyone's taste, but I'm really passionate that I think it can work, but I think it relies on having no less leadership, sponsorship, voice, and advocacy and intervention than if you're a very heavily metrics-led organization.
Rachel, what's your response to that, especially doing the Parker review?
Yeah, I think that I would agree, and just slightly not accusing Stuart of dodging the question of which comes first, but I will dodge that question because I think that it's a virtuous cycle either way. I think that does inclusivity come first, or does diversity come first? I think that both are an evolution, and therefore, sort of a chicken and the egg sort of a situation. But what I would say is that something I talk about a lot is that we own meritocracy. So those of us who are interested in the gender agenda and other equality of opportunity agendas, that we actually lead by talking about meritocracy. Because in the conversations that I still have today, the pushback that I get is, if you think about the most unreconstructed sort of old guard, will say, well, I believe that the best person should get the best job, that sort of thing. That's exactly what we believe. That's about leveling the playing field, about having inclusive cultures that mean irrespective of ethnicity, gender, socioeconomic background, geography, etc., that those who work the hardest and have the greatest talent rise to the top.
And Cody, what are you seeing on the ground? Is it numbers game or is it a culture game?
I really liked how Stuart talked about it, and ultimately I think diversity is an outcome, but where you're starting from, there's a reality check.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, National Grid's had a lot of momentum because we did put some targets down, because we did follow a very clear, measured strategy. And, we're getting closer and closer to the goals that we've set. So 30% female representation on our board, gender parity at the leadership level. 4 of our 6 business units in National Grid are led by women. So we're in the big P&L jobs. We've hit 35% for middle management a year earlier, which is a target we set in our Responsible Business Charter. So there's tremendous power in declaring and measuring. But, spending all that time on attraction and bringing in, and then not having the culture that then creates momentum, creates belonging, and then seeing those incomers thrive. We've got to have diversity and inclusion hand in hand. And there is a risk of people focusing now on difference and not inclusion through targets. And probably our biggest set of programmes this year in National Grid are around an inclusive culture and leaning into respect and valuing difference, giving voice to our employee resource groups, because we need to retain and we need to see people thrive.
How about you?
Yeah, again, I really echo most people's comments just on a practical level. So Good Energy is relatively small. We have 450 employees. We are one of the organisations that has over 40% representation of women on the board. I am one of the 16% that is an executive director and on the board of Good Energy. And we have a really strong pipeline of female talent at the next level, getting close to 50%. I've been working for 10 years on the culture within the organisation, and it's been very purposely focused on inclusion with monitoring of diversity along the way. And I think, again, when we think about inclusion, another way I like to talk about it in the boardroom is it's about making sure people get equal access if they can, and it should pervade, in our experience, into things as much as governance. So if we talk about boardroom experience and even experience of how to make decisions, if you're not allowing people into boards to see how it is done, it is much harder for them on a practical level to learn. So actually, as a for example, in our culture at the level under the board, we have a lot of openness about a set of governance meetings in which all of the decisions in our organisation are taken, and quite a broad church of people that are invited, notes that are open and transparent, and therefore quite a high degree of trust around how we make decisions and why. And it's one of the most empowering ways of developing people, women included, because they understand who's making the decisions and why they're making it. And it's, it's on a very practical level. The only other practical thing I'd say back to boards and my own example is the 16%. Many boards, to your point, only have a CEO and a CFO as the executive director roles on the boards. I am a COO. And because I come from a background where I learned operations, sales, marketing, HR, those skills, and my board were good in considering that this is a less usual role to place on the board, but one that has a huge amount of value to the organisation. And that has opened up an opportunity that otherwise would not be there. So I do think that more broadly, we need to think creatively about who is on boards and why. And if you can't be on the board, how do you give women lots of experience and exposure to boards? Because it's the piece that, when you go to apply for a board position, is the piece you need. So just a couple of bits of practical example.
I've heard importance of measuring, kind of repeating from many of you. One statistics that kind of hit me is actually only 31 of the 80 companies were reporting their middle management statistics. Now, I don't know whether they are they are measuring but not reporting. But 31 out of 80 seemed a low number, and therefore made me worried about, is the pipeline robust and what are we doing about the next generations? Any reflections on that? On maybe encouraging, should this be mandatory, from a policy regulation perspective? Maybe starting in the middle, I start with Courtney, how about that?
Well, I think we've wanted to take as an organisation a leadership role, and that doesn't deal with the laggards. So, your point. But and so, we're trying to address every level within our organisation and building the talent pipelines within the organisation now. Major focus on graduate intake, apprenticeships, which is really, really hard in the technical field. I've got 6,500 people across electricity distribution. Our sector as an intake at that level is nowhere near attractive enough at the moment. They have been traditionally male roles, and we haven't done a good enough job of coming together and showing what's possible. And I think we've got to really challenge ourselves. I mean, we could be forced to do things, but I prefer to want to do them for all the right reasons that we've talked about. And so I think it was about 2 years ago, we said, let's focus on talent intake and agree as an organisation 50% diversity in our intake every single year. And we're absolutely doing it on the graduates, which is great. The apprenticeships are harder, and we've got to reframe the art of the possible. And I'm in the mood, and I'm hoping I've got the right environment to create it, to get into all female apprenticeships in the sort of technical aspects of networks and distribution. We've started, I was speaking to some of my managers yesterday. In Telford, we've got 2 lineswomen about to graduate, and we buddied them up. They're so amazing role models. It's so possible to be a lineswoman. But how do they go forth into the business? They can't be on their own. So you've got to sort of get a level of intake up and then body them and then put them with their most progressive leaders. So there's a lot of care and attention we're having to put into these entry points and dispelling the myths, but making sure we think very holistically about the environment, the leaders that they work for. We have now got an inclusion index for all of our leaders, which really starts to sift out who's up for the job, who can create that environment. So when you bring these new areas of talent and focus in. So I'd rather lead than be told what to do. Mm-hmm. I want us as an organisation and as a sector to take responsibility. And I've now got to be even braver about how I go about that and how holistically we need to think about that.
Something, actually what you said struck me as well. It's, you want to be a leader, you cannot regulate, but apprenticeship is hard. I'm actually kind of going to bring forward another question I wanted to ask anyway. So it is specifically for you, Rachel and Stuart. It's measurement, pay, gender pay gap, that created a lot of attention was paid. That's one side. Educational system, the pipeline is another side. Is there a bigger role for policymakers and regulators to help the companies?
Yes. Well, I don't know whether you've noticed, but I'm madly taking notes here because I love the idea of sort of, I think you said an inclusion index, and also the idea of democratization of knowledge. So that sort of insight in terms of what happens within the board. From a government point of view, we're really keen, also certainly have been for the last decade, to not be telling businesses what to do, but nevertheless to be providing platforms for transparency. And so, say on the FTSE Women Leaders Review, I think that's been a demonstration of that, what a driver that can be. You know, we're very careful in our wording, so we talk about sort of voluntary census, and it's all very voluntary, but the peer pressure and the sort of the mounting over time through that sort of iterative yearly sort of report that happens, I think has proved to be effective. And that you get to the point where the leaders are actually, we in collaboration are helping the leaders sort of display your outcomes and therefore have the platforms to talk about how you're doing it. So I think that in government at the moment it's fair to say that we are intending on continuing in that same approach, because I think that business-led, sector-specific, context-specific, you know your business is better than we do, is to continue, but we're certainly looking obviously towards net zero, etc. And the idea that we need to reskill sort of the population, we need to look at where we're losing talent, etc. So those different levers from across Whitehall, from sort of early years education through to apprenticeships and women returners. And actually an accident that I make is that I say women returners, but really by design, the policy for returns is about returners male or female.
Yes.
And the idea that we don't automatically assume that it's women who take the bulk of maternity leave, etc., parental leave. See, it's in our language, but that's sort of actually really redressing so that men can take advantage of flexible working and, you know, taking time out, coming back in.
And Stuart, what are you seeing in the North Sea?
So, I mean, first thing, clearly, I'll defer to Rachel, because this is what she does. She knows this stuff. So I'm going to agree with everything that Rachel just said. And the North Sea and the oil and gas industry, as an example, one of the challenges, if we're really candid, is it's been a very boy-led industry. So boy-led behaviours, quite competitive, quite macho, and that's been a challenge on lots of issues, including commercial behaviours and all sorts of things for decades. But that can also be a real advantage to play into, because that also drives competition. And so what we've done over the last few years is try and use some of the tools that we use when we regulate on all sorts of other areas, which exactly as Rachel said is about transparency of data. It's not about telling people what to do. It's about being the authoritative source about what has been done and making that visible to people and their peers and their competition. And so one of the things we did in this space over the last 2 years is sit with all of the leading operators in the North Sea and the supply chain companies, which is really important to remember in this discussion, because the 80% of the workforce in the offshore sector don't work for the oil and gas companies, they work for the supply chain. And we talked to them about their performance on a number of metrics around diversity and inclusion. We talked to them about their membership of things like Powerful Women and the Access Network, particularly in the northeast of Scotland. And we asked them to share success and challenges as stories. Not only did we publish those, but we also brought them together and did them as group projects. So they would be typically my then boss, my predecessor, and myself, and one of my colleagues, Elaine. We would sit with each of these companies, typically 4 of them, in a virtual setting usually, and we would go through their stories. And what was fascinating was you could see the discomfort in some cases where the chief exec, or the MD, the boss, who was typically but not exclusively male, had their HR leader, who was typically but not exclusively female. And where they had a good story to tell, you could see that the boss owned the story. Where they didn't, you could see the boss was hearing it, not for the first time, but he was probably not much more briefed on it than we were. And the discomfort was palpable, because what then followed was you'd have a really engaged company where the leader would tell a story and keep checking with the HR colleague and say, did I, you know, anything you want to add? Did I get that right? But I'm really passionate about this. So I think the regulators have a role to reinforce, to amplify, to hold and use data, and also to encourage participation in things like Powerful Women. And we did, and we asked the very direct question for those that don't take part: why? What is literally stopping you? And I think that's a role we can play. I think policy is a matter for central government, and I think Rachel's articulated that perfectly well. Yeah, so I do think regulators, and I suspect Jonathan, from an Ofgem perspective, would say something relatively similar.
Thank you. No, I just wanted to follow up because I absolutely loved your from the table face stories, inclusion index, the democratization, the showcasing of how a board works and how decisions are made. Any more stories? Any more practical advice from your experience? Maybe for the laggards. And I start with you, Fran.
I guess, again, back to practical challenges. In my experience, a good test of how inclusive your workforce is, and also an imperative from a data and a monitoring perspective, is what percentage of people in your organisation have actively told you about themselves in terms of all of their protected characteristics. So we monitor really closely that over 90% of people actually tell us a lot of information about themselves. And if we haven't even got that information, then we haven't got two things. We haven't got trust because they're frightened, they're not sure why they should. And if we haven't got the information, as it showed in the report, we can't tell what the diversity is of our workforce. So that's, I guess, just a practical challenge piece. On the government and regulator question, I did want to get something in, which would have been helpful if Jonathan had been here as well, but that is back to how attractive we are as a sector.
Right.
You know, there aren't that many senior women in the UK full stop by the time you get to the top, and therefore we have this fantastic sector, I think, that needs, to your point, to deliver a transformation, and we need to attract the best people. I'd like government and even the regulators to think sometimes about the tone in which we are portrayed, especially to UK households. You know, we're probably not up there as the friendly face that you necessarily want to work for. And that, you know, in the last couple of years, obviously, you know, we understand there've been things that shouldn't have happened and we all need to take accountability for. But I think it's getting that balance right when you know, most of the organisations are trying very hard to provide an essential service to millions of people across the UK in the best way they possibly can. And I think for attracting talent, inclusive of all talent and women, it's just a thought. I think we need to pay attention to the balance sometimes as to how we're portrayed.
Thank you.
I'll add to that. I mean, the self-identification point is really well made, and we've got a programme at the moment rolling out in National Grid, #ThisIsMe. Let's just talk about ourselves, what makes us unique and special and different, and why we want to sort of bring you into the conversation. So that's really important to us this year. We've been looking at, we offer a lot of training interventions that are really valuable for generating inclusion. We don't make them mandatory specifically because we think it needs to be self-owned and self-managed, but actually shining a light on who's really pulling on those interventions and taking that back for executive discussion. And are we creating those conversations where this is what good looks like rather than we're going to make you do? And I think that's been very valuable for us because we've got a really great off-the-shelf set of packages and we just need to get, you know, self-motivation up to use them. The behaviours point that Stuart raised, I think is really important. And, you know, the worst, you know, the worst behaviour that we walk by is it sets the culture actually. And so we've had a lot of campaigns around it's not okay. And that's part of our onboarding, because if you've got very large sort of field forces, you know, the risk of banter and how that plays out and those small acts that really hurt the culture and well-being of an individual, we need to redress that. So it's not okay too, it is okay too. So there's a sort of education and an explanation that needs to happen. And then your point on sector attractiveness, you know, was very well made. And just to call out a piece of work that the Energy Leaders Coalition sort of signed on to last year and is funding again this year, is a sector attractiveness campaign that is actually flipping the narrative on our purpose, our mission, our role. And that's all of the companies in the ELC who are funding that. You know, and I'm in my 27th year in the industry. So, you know, for the dinosaur, I'm not on the channels that young women and young men are looking at industry roles and jobs. And, you know, we've got this great organisation in to trial, you know, influencer styles, at TikTok, wherever those places are now. And we got a completely different reaction to the role and the scale of opportunity in our sector. So it was so enticing that we said, let's do more this year to see how we can ramp it up. And that fed the apprenticeship programmes in a different way, which I think was really important. And the one thing that, you know, as a parent of 2 young children, we also looked at the role of parents through Facebook. And are they encouraging our sector? Do they understand? And are they having those conversations at home? So yes, I think there's more to be done at the sort of regulatory political level, but there's also different methods that we need to embrace and different ways of talking about our sector that could really move the dial here.
Now, I'm going to ask last question myself of the panel. So please reflect, keep your questions, both we'll take them from the online audience and in the room. But before we go there, hopefully this one is going to be shorter answers, because we had so many good ideas, such an amazing discussion. And you could say it's all great, but we at Bain are all focused on results. We want to make sure that the work we do with companies makes a difference. We talk about this thing about, okay, Monday morning actions. So very hard, actually. If you were to give advice to an energy company for just one thing they should do next week, Monday morning, actually it's bank holiday, Tuesday morning, what would it be? And I start with you, Fran, if I may.
Oh. Well, perhaps as I mentioned it last, simply I'd go back and I guess go find out about the diversity of your workforce. So I would put the challenge out about starting with getting people to engage by telling you about themselves. So then you know what you're working with in the first place.
Yeah. Yeah, I would sort of reiterate similar. I'd say that you should be mining the data in your specific context, making iterative change, repeat, you know, and I think that something that we're looking at is sort of really the pipeline, which I feel like is the ultimate kind of, how does it go? Fail to prepare, prepare to fail, sort of, you know, it's not just measuring what have we got now, but who's coming through, and also that holistic point about how are they being managed, what's middle management doing in terms of retention.
Thank you. Carty, any advice from you?
Just one deliberate, highly visible act, because we set the weather in the organisation, and it could be anything. Get the stats, declare a conference, elevate an ERG. There's so many things, but one deliberate but highly visible act, as strong as you can make it, because you set the tone.
Stuart?
Yeah, I agree with all of those. The one I would probably be tempted to do and the one I will do is share the report. Share the report with staff, and in doing so, be really brave and say, I'm a bit smart about us because when I look at the data, we're doing great on X, and I'm a bit worried because when I look at the data, we're not doing very well on Y. And allow that conversation. And I love the point around inviting people to explain to you who they are. It's the most at the center of having a relationship with your employees. Inviting people into the conversation is really important. So don't make it something where people feel they're sort of in trouble if they criticize or challenge. Invite it and just say, let's celebrate a win, well done. And let's now be uncomfortable because we've got a gap to other people and a gap to where we should be. But it starts with sharing the report.
Any questions from the audience? Oh my gosh, I will need help here. We'll start on the left, please. Oh my gosh, I am.
Okay, thank you so much for this conversation. And what resonated with me the most was the power of the role models, individual role models. And Claudine, Katie, you've been talking about this. And I thought, how many of us here by design came to this industry instead of by default? And that made me think back to Claudine, what we were talking about in a, maybe like almost in the childhood. I was asking this question to myself, can we do something more at the childhood age, going to schools, creating this role of the role models individually for people, for kids, which are inclusively, we're not going to be talking to just the girls, but actually being there ourselves will increase the confidence for girls, but more also the knowledge and awareness that there is such an industry, there is such a sector which can be interesting. That will go also to the attractiveness of the energy, but also being there, I think will create so much more of the confidence in kids, but also purpose for ourselves. And I was just thinking, I'm trying to reach to some of the schools in my neighborhood, but if it's something on the radar for powerful women, I'm very happy to volunteer myself there as well and just go that road and help raising this awareness and actually help the younger generation to think of this path potentially. So is it something which kind of resonates with you and your path, how much of by design it was instead of by default when you came to energy? Thank you.
May I start with Fran and Corey on this?
I came into the energy industry completely by default 13 years ago, being honest. And I suppose it's my career history won't be atypical for someone who started 30 years ago, which was I went up very rapidly through an FMCG route to a big job. Then when I had children working for an American firm 15, 20 years ago, zero flexibility whatsoever. And so in order to have a period where I could flex with kids, I became a professional interim and consultant. And in that context, I went to work for EDF to start with. And that was my introduction to the energy industry, kind of about halfway through my career. Actually, you know, I loved what I found. I had no idea about it before, really. It never even occurred to me as a sector that would be interesting. But the sheer breadth of it and complexity and the human aspects of it, combined with the technical, I thought were really interesting. But it was completely by chance. So, yeah, I think, you know, I went into a generating part of the business as well. It was a very male environment, much more so than any of the other industries I'd worked in as well. So those are those two elements that struck me at that point. So I'm sure you're right. Perhaps there is more we can do earlier.
Yeah, similar but different story. So I don't think I knew what the energy sector was. And I'm the eldest of 5 children. From a working class family with neither side ever. So I was the first to go to university. So for me, it was about where is there a professional degree that can get me somewhere, and I chose law. So I was going down the law track, and it was only a very large credit card bill after a gap year that I did some temporary work in Yorkshire Electricity before going to go to law school. And I fell into it. I kind of fell in love with it. It was really quite extraordinary. And much to my parents' horror, didn't follow through on law school. And I had the benefit of amazing male sponsors who could see something in me that I absolutely couldn't see in myself. I was in probably the quite macho end of it as well, because I worked in the control rooms, and then I did trading. And then I did asset management, and that got me to the power stations and the gas fields. The breadth of the industry is phenomenal. The range of roles I've had the privilege to do in 27 years is phenomenal. So we really need to be deliberate. We shouldn't all just be falling in there by accident now with the size and scale of the, you know, both the reskilling and the and the new role attraction. So I think, again, the leading companies are doing the STEM outreach programs, which we do. We're doing the sort of family days. Let's make this real and inspire our children or relatives or friends who want to come along. And we are doing very deliberate publications of our best female role models generally in our organisation at all levels, because role models matter at all levels.
I'm going to now look at some questions that are coming online, and this one is probably best for you, Rachel, but also potentially, maybe not. Sorry, just for Rachel. So, how do we combine energy versus other sectors, if you know, and what are the learnings that energy could be taking from other sectors?
So I'd say I'll give it to you at high level because I'm not close enough to the data, but I would say not very well. In answer to the first question, I think that sort of comparable levels to the tobacco industry, which I think that in itself says quite a lot. And I think that also speaks to what you were saying about sort of perception of the industry. And when, in relation to the last question, I think about my own career trajectory in the public sector and public service, but the energy industry is such a service industry. And I think so, therefore, our engagement ought to be twofold in terms of young girls, school children. On the one hand, it's about engineering as an aspiration and broadening horizons in that way, and girls' engagement in STEM. But on the other hand, it's about perceptions of different talents coming into this industry, and that you don't have to be, the stereotypical boy who likes, that sort of thing. Because just like when I talk to sort of the tech industry, the idea of AI and what it takes to be an AI engineer, that you actually need the people who are doing the philosophy and the psychology and all of those sorts of things to do that well. And again, it's going to have seismic consequences for our society.
Thank you. Questions from the audience, please.
I'm Jingo Ray, Jackson's. Just speaking a little bit of foolish because I was in Poland. I was really interested to hear what the contributions everybody made. And every time I have discussions on women on boards, I see that there's a lack of intersectionality. And what I mean by intersectionality, we're not just talking about women in boards, but we're actually talking about the different groups of women who form the general population. And the Monday advice I'd like to give all of you, say anything, is over the weekend, write your 5 closest friends, people you would go to for advice, and look at their demographics, look at their background. And if it's very diverse, that's going to obviously impact the way, the filter in which you do your work. And we never talk about that. And when we look at the civil rights movement, which has formed the foundation for many, many groups and changes, it was an intersectional one. And because of the intersectionality of the civil rights movement, many other groups have formed. The last point I'd like to make is that we need to look at the supply chain. In 2030, McKinsey estimates that the largest youth population is going to be in Africa. And many parts of Africa are matrilineal. So that means women have control in what they do. Now, if we're having supply chain problems right now, I don't want to get political because I'm not a politician, I say something wrong. If we're having problems right now, and we're increasingly getting global, the Silk Road is increasingly getting stronger, and the different resource mix is also different. We need to take this intersectionality issue very, very strongly so that we can actually make Britain much more of a leader because it's tackling these problems in an intersectional manner. Thank you very much.
It actually ties with a number of questions coming online. And there are 2 kind of themes to your question. One, looking at wider diversity, intersectionality, I can't pronounce that, sorry, English not good enough. And the other is not just companies themselves, but the whole supply chain and how we engage the whole supply chain. I think everybody has something to add here. So if it's okay, maybe Stuart, I start with you, work that way. Thank you.
I think I got the question, so if I'm going completely wrong, interrupt me, please, if I'm answering the wrong question. I think if I just take the offshore industry, it is a massive supply chain, number one. You're talking about hundreds of thousands of people, but it's also a massively overlapping supply chain. So the very big firms that work in that sector are also working in power, and they're working in construction, and they're working across a variety of things. And so I think one of the things we have to keep doing is trying to engage with a real purpose. And I could stitch together the earlier conversations around, for example, how do we make the energy sector more generally continue to be attractive? And if we don't, by the way, not just to women, but to anybody, we have a real crisis on our hands in terms of being able to bring in the talent we need, is trying to find a common challenge, a common cause. So I think one of the areas you could engage the supply chain more successfully on, we could all think about how we do that, is exactly that challenge of how do we help them to be attractive to talent in the 2030s and beyond, which would include obviously reaching out to less represented groups, but actually it's a generic problem as well. So I think engaging the supply chain is very difficult because it's diverse and big and overlapping. I think finding a reason, a thing we're doing with them that is also in their benefit directly is a smart way of starting.
Rachel, do you add your thoughts?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the way that you started the question with who are the 5 people that you go to, I think again, sort of from one end of the spectrum to the other, talking about the supply chain takes us back to why that diversity in leadership is so important. Both in terms of the branding of the industry and why people would want to be involved or not, but also those sort of ways in and those levers. One of the things that we've been involved in driving in government is the move away from the Bain sort of category, the homogenized sort of sense of Bain being something that you can really do anything with at all. And I think sort of the stats for sort of what would have been categorized as Bain within the energy industry are really interesting. So that I think you have, I won't give you the numbers because again, but sort of if you look at sort of Asian communities even, which is not homogenous in itself compared to Black communities, I think it's 3% Black communities is sort of a good representation of Asian communities, and then within that India does better than, you know, that sort of thing. So I think that again, sort of that holistic and the back and forth, I think that again it speaks to how having that diversity in the centre can also
Yeah, we've been having growing conversations in Grid about intersectionality. It's a much more complicated, in-depth discussion, right? It's not easy either. But I think we've started, which is a good place, right? We've thought about, well, how does that play into the signals we send to our supply chain and our external partners? We have to, we've done the right thing, the responsible thing in terms of holding our supply chain to account for the sourcing of the materials, the conditions of employment. There is a lot of overlap, as Stuart said. So there's this constant, the more we demand higher standards, the more we shouldn't have risk of exclusion from certain aspects of the supply chain. But that's the sort of delicate balance we've got to navigate, I think. But we do need to do the right thing. Some of the programs I'm most proud of is when we've actively thought differently about supply chain. Has been, for example, leading a project with a real partner for offshore wind in New York, where environmental justice was a big part of winning the proposals and getting a state contract. And actually, we put proposals forward that they were minority businesses run by women that actually could offer into new supply chain materials for those activities. And it's a really small programme, but signalling intent and broader thinking about what's the right thing to do, particularly when you're putting infrastructure in new places and attracting new aspects of the supply chain. But we're early stages, but we are trying and we are starting. But we rise to your challenge.
Supply chain.
For our supply chain relative, I feel we're very, I mean, no, compared to what
Okay.
these guys are talking
Okay.
about in that context. So but I wholeheartedly support where they're at.
Thank you. So I'm conscious the snacks are just coming in, so I am going to take, I know it's huge enthusiasm here. Let me take 2 more questions from the floor, 1 more question from online. Please, we should have a ball or something.
Sorry?
I'm saying we should have like a pass a microphone or a ball.
No,
Sorry.
it's fine. So I'm Neil McGuinness now from BP. Thank you very much for today, by the way. Following on from the intersectionality point, I think last week we heard the Minister of State without portfolio, Esther McVey, in her attempts to remove rainbow lanyards and non-conform lanyards, as well as disbanding BRGs within the civil service. And my question or my concern is about the mood music that's setting for efforts in companies like ours, where we are trying to create diversity and encourage equity of opportunity. And I'm interested to get your view, please. Are we letting the blue team or the red team off the hook a little bit because we're afraid of challenging them? And how do we set the mood music in a way that it will attract the best talent to our companies?
So I think this is for Fran and Molly.
Yes, definitely not for me. I will, yeah.
Challenging back the policymakers.
Yeah. Yes. I think we've said it, haven't we? It's a different way of saying it, that we need to have that. We need to have that openness to looking at talent, I think, for a start, in quite a different way. And, I keep coming back to, you've got to scratch under the surface to the actual ways of doing things, I think, to start to make a difference. If talent is always defined by experience, it will always be an exclusive, slow-moving process of change. So, we talk a lot about we need open talent processes, then we have to redefine what talent is. So I suppose slightly broader answer to it is worrying.
Yeah, maybe just a sort of personal comment. We haven't had the opportunity yet to sit down as an executive and debate it, and I no doubt we will. Because we've put so much effort and emphasis on raising the voices and bringing diverse voices together. So not only did we set out a global strategy 2 years ago to elevate our employee resource groups, and then we said, and now let's collaborate together to learn from each other. And I've only seen positive discussion from that. And so it was a hard article to read on a personal level, when I've seen tremendous value personally for my own learning journey, as well as for populations having a voice and then sharing their experiences from quite unique perspectives. So, on a personal level, I believe, and I've seen the benefit. So do we need a different conversation on what's behind that? And can we bring forward the best of the business examples where this makes a difference? But I want to have that discussion back at the launch.
One more question, maybe from the back left-hand side there.
Thank you. Jill Anderson, also BP. On the just one thing, sometimes that's said to be equal parental leave because of how that sets the tone, whether or not people want to have children or it doesn't personally impact them. I wonder if any of the panel have experience of implementing that and how you've overcome any challenges to do so, because we know that that makes a real difference to gender pay gap, progression, motherhood penalty. Yeah, keen to hear.
Stuart, in your HR roles previously, any experience in that you would like to share?
I would love to. I'm going to be annoying. I missed the first few words of the question. I'm really sorry. I got most of it, but I missed the first few words.
Equal maternity,
Equal
leave-
parental.
equal parental leave, practicality of implementing. I guess that's the question.
Yeah. So I think the practicality challenges that we faced, limited, but where they've occurred, is going to be around encouraging uptake, encouraging then role models. So go back to the very beginning. One of my directors took a significant amount, not equal, but significant amount of parental leave off, and was very conscious to do that visibly, which was uncomfortable for him, but I'm glad that he did that. I'd go a very slight tangent if I could, only because it's happened to us in the last week. I actually wrote to all of my staff on Friday of last week because a similar issue, which is around, I think most organizations that are good are reasonably good around the issue of children and how children impact our lives as we go through working careers. I think what's often harder, and I'm personally living with some of this at the moment, is when we have responsibilities at the other end of the age scale of family, which can be equally challenging, disruptive, and emotionally difficult to deal with. And so we wrote to everybody to say, my observation is there's an awful lot of people in our organization who are currently going through a version of this from what we can see, and we want to have a conversation about it. We want to make clear you know where to go for resource and support, but also to make it clear what our view is in terms of the space we want you to have to make those things happen. I don't think I've ever had more responses to an all staff email in my life. And every single one of them was from people who we did not know were struggling, that disclosed horrendous stories of wrestling with long geographies, parents with horrible illnesses and difficulty. So helping to create that inclusive environment where you say to people, you and the whole of you is valued and wanted, and that includes us giving you some space and time occasionally, and that people do that and the world doesn't end, I think is really important. That's really important around the shared equal parental stuff, but I also think it's important in other areas as well.
I'm going to close with a more positive question. It actually came here online. Fran and Collie, you are from companies that are actually doing quite well. What is the practical impact you are seeing of being on the forefront of achieving diversity?
I mean, ours is just as we've talked about, is that we've seen a significant increase in all forms of diversity in our organisation. So the whole thing's gone together over the last 3 or 4 years, whether that's ethnic diversity, neurodiversity, disability, all of our stats have shifted a fair bit in the right direction. So, and I think it comes back to the culture piece. In all honesty, I think we're not perfect though, and I really took on board some of your challenge today. I thought that was really interesting, and we've got a long way to go still. But you know, our employees, the conversation at the moment is about class and privilege as well. You know, so we're starting to get into that space. So I feel that that's a good indicator of being small but on the right path.
I mean, just like you, we've just seen a positive shift in all of our measures, and that feels good for a really large organisation doing really purposeful, meaningful work, and we do serve. You know, just in my business alone, 25 million households rely on us to keep the lights on, and in the future fuel their cars and potentially heat their homes. So it's a great responsibility. But it gives a genuine sense of pride, and we now retain so many people because one of our core values is doing it, and it's demonstrated, and it's not perfect at all, but we aspire to be better.
Thank you. That's wonderful thought to wrap up on. I know we have covered a huge amount of ground. It is impossible to summarize. That I would just say, I try like 2-word phrases that really struck me from this discussion. Fran, the sector attractiveness point, really, really important. And also I love all of your thoughts on democratizing knowledge, showing how the job is done, demystifying. for the inclusion index, we have to all find out what is the inclusion index, the secret sauce, and not okay. That's another amazing. Rachel, I love your point that laggards, focus on laggards. It's really not that hard. Will make a big difference. And also returners. It is not. You don't have to go stay for the whole pipeline, but think about how you are more flexible. Stuart, love your points on this is really table stakes and how you bring the whole industry together to compare, contrast, and challenge. That is a great role of the regulator. Thank you. Well, I shall not keep you more away from stacks. Thank you. Real pleasure.